Okie dokie. Alrighty then. Okay, so yesterday, welcome to dis and dat information. It's the 11th, I think, of March. Time flies when we're having so much fun. I decided that after looking at the network state from yesterday, which, um, as I said, is an interesting read. However, historically flawed and really just simply a representation of a certain brand of libertarianism. Sort of Ayn Rand with extra money. But so I decided today that I would revisit EF Schumacher, and Schumacher is, of course, been covered by other folks. Tom, Texas Tom Weber has looked at EF Schumacher, and I'm sure my point of view on it is quite different than Tom's. I think Tom wants to is interested in the spiritual elements of it, and I think that that's really important from an ecumenical point of view. That is that I think you can have a Buddhist economy, but as Myanmar has sort of shown, Buddhist economy doesn't stop people from killing people. As in Buddhist preemptive violence. But on the other hand, the Buddhist, the Myanmar insurgency has been around for so long, and that may be simply a result of residual Buddhism that they really can't wipe out an insurgency for very Buddhist reasons. But anyway, uh, that's obviously oversimplifying Myanmar. So anyway, Schumacher's point still stands that first, you can't just carry on exponentially increasing fossil fuel consumption, which you can only understand when you grasp that humanity has been using up its natural capital as if it were a renewable resource. And that image of a renewable resource, or actually an infinite resource, hence the desire to go to Mars, is built on a certain degree of ignorance. And so I've looked at the Schumacher Center for New Economics, which is I think it's in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Um, it's an interesting place. I may even go up for a lecture at some moment. But I think you can also see that the Schumacher Center and Schumacherism does have a certain, perhaps a certain liberal flavor to it that, um, or cult-like, perhaps. I wouldn't go that far. I think it has certain authenticity and commitment, but I also think that it needs to be better engaged academically. But anyway, they have interesting stuff there, a Center for New Economics. And of course, new economics is demanded by all kinds of folks, even in Great Barrington. Considering that the that other group of libertarians is actually there, those money folks, money libertarians are there. So there's a file on the site that includes decentralism, which decentralizing thing I think is a good idea, but is it or should it be identical to degrowth? So among other D-like things. Let's just review Schumacher in perhaps a more literary way first, and then come to grips with what Schumacher sort of represents in the broader context. I would assert, for my own research purposes, that what Schumacher describes as a steady state economy, and without getting into all the issues about the plentiful and other ways of conducting a Buddhist life and having a Buddhist economy. Now, if we set that aside for the moment and think about equilibria, That is, that partial equilibria describes a certain way in which one can talk about capital. Uh, and and the partial equilibria I was talking about is the one sort of before about catastrophe. And I think that there's some metaphorical versions of it that are actually quite interesting that do go back to the 19th century, but that are quite unlike Marx, for example. But that's fine because as you've probably noticed, I don't go pulling out Marx every which way, because frankly, as I've said, and I think other people will agree with me, that we've sort of we haven't moved past Marx so much as we've sort of built on a foundation that's worth considering and have sort of transcended certain notions that are hitherto anachronistic in the history of Marxist critique of political economy. That doesn't mean to say that we were going to stop critiquing it or that multiple equilibria or a general equilibria or something like it isn't worth sort of thinking about. We have to go further and look at other matters. So um, Schumacher begins with an apt anecdotal metaphor for how these misleading maps are handed to us. That is, the maps are misleading because any map has a dimensional relationship to reality. It is not reality itself. So, on a visit to Leningrad some years ago, this is um, Schumacher. I consulted a map to find out where it was, but I could not make it out. I could see several enormous churches, yet there was no trace of them on my map. When finally an interpreter came to help me, he said, "We don't show churches on our maps." Contradicting him, I pointed to one that was very clearly marked. This is a museum, he said, not what we call a living church. It is only the living churches we don't show, which is an interesting notion, but very consistent actually within the Soviet Union. Then Schumacher says it then occurred to me that this was not the first time I'd been given a map that failed to show many of the things I could see right in front of my eyes. This is actually very popular in the Soviet Union. That is, Soviet geography tended to disappear cities because for security reasons or for other gulag-like purposes. All through school and university, I had been given maps of life and knowledge on which there was hardly a trace of many of the things that I most cared about, and that seemed to me to be of the greatest possible importance for the conduct of my life. I remember that for many years my perplexity was complete, and no interpreter came along to help me. It remained complete until I ceased to suspect the sanity of my perceptions and began instead to suspect the soundness of the maps. And that's an interesting question. It is a kind of flattening, as one could say. Um, Schumacher maps out four essential levels of being and proposes a model, a formula of sorts for how they relate to one another, and where they belong on the philosophical map. M, as in Mickey Mouse, marks the mineral level of an inorganic matter. X is the life force of organic matter, which animates plants and animals, setting them apart from rocks. Y denotes consciousness, which distinguishes a cat from catnip, although it has been argued since Schumacher's time that plants may have a consciousness-like capacity. Well, yes and no. They have perhaps a zoosemiotic capacity, which is actually quite useful. But anyway, and Z, as in Z, which denotes the human capacity for self-awareness. Schumacher considers this uniquely human, though one could presently argue questionably so faculty. The power Z has undoubtedly a great deal to do with the fact that man is not only able to think, but is also able to be aware of his thinking. And that's the whole issue of consciousness. Consciousness and intelligence, as it were, recoil upon themselves. There is not merely a conscious being, but a being capable of being conscious of its consciousness, not merely a thinker, but a thinker capable of watching and studying his own thinking. There is something able to say, I and to direct consciousness in accordance with its own purposes, a master or controller, a power at a higher level than consciousness itself. This power Z, consciousness recoiling upon itself, opens up unlimited possibilities of purposeful learning, investigating, exploring, and of formulating and accumulating knowledge. Note that a recoiling thing would tend to not simply be a perfect spiral or a perfect cylinder or a coil, but perhaps a spiral. So, anyway, which gets us back into other metaphors. We must, however, take great care always to remember that such a word label is merely, to use a Buddhist phrase, a finger pointing to the moon. The moon itself remains highly mysterious and needs to be studied with the greatest patience and perseverance if we want to understand anything about man's position in the universe. So that's interesting. Others might want to go to Mars for other interesting reasons. By this model, then, a rock is described as M, a plant as M plus X, an animal as M plus X plus Y, and a human being as M plus X plus Y plus Z. You could even argue Hegelianism here, but that's a whole nother story, where scientific reductionism and philosophies like skepticism fall short, Schumacher argues, is in dealing with the lowest level M and pretending the rest don't exist. And so this is a guide for the perplexed, the meaning of life, and the four levels of being. You know, you can see that there's a philosophical model, spiritual model going on there, which certainly is important in its own way. But we need to go back and remember that E.F. Schumacher was in charge of the Coal Board of England for many times, for many years, or he's the chief economist for the Coal Board. And so he has a thing. He understands fossil fuel in the most basic way. And A Guide for the Perplexed is excellent in its entirety. Pair it with Schumacher on how to stop prioritizing goods over people, and Alan Watts on becoming who you really are. All excellent ideas. So on the Small is Beautiful, the Schumacher site, the Schumacher Center site, they include a piece that was put up only a year or so ago now, and it is the revisiting of Small is Beautiful for at the 50th anniversary. You know, for many people, you know, who may have been in college during the 70s, this was an important text. Small is Beautiful. 50 years later, a study guide. So David Boyle writes this study guide, and it's a useful study guide. Probably better if you read Schumacher first, but even in and of itself, I think it's worth studying simply because it pares down a lot of the things and updates some other things which have changed over 50 years. Small is Beautiful still is useful to us, I think, in thinking about, and with all due respect to Schumacher, steady state economies. And I think this is very important because some of the first work that tried to incorporate Schumacher were Scandinavian economists, more specifically. And so that's its own history is sort of interesting in that particular context. The background history, of course, is that Schumacher knew Keynes, and so that there is a kind of post-Keynesian element to this whole business here. Introduction, one of the most fateful errors of our age is the belief that the problem of production has been solved. Not only is the belief firmly held by people remote from production and therefore professionally unacquainted with the facts, it is held by virtually all the experts, the captains of industry, the economic managers in the governments of the world, the academic and not so academic economists, not to mention the economic journalists. They may disagree on many things, but they all agree that the problem of production has been solved, that mankind has at last come of age, you know, not unlike the end of history. For the rich countries, they say, the most important task is now education for leisure, and the poor countries, the transfer of technology. That's EF Schumacher, the opening lines of Small is Beautiful. Most of the environmental movement takes a utilitarian ecology approach that we must protect the environment because it is useful and beneficial to human beings. Schumacher's approach was that we must all take care of the environment out of our deep reverence for it. Boyle calls the Schumachian approach to the environment reverential ecology. Reverential economy and ecology say that you must know your limits and learn to live within them. Then everything will be recycled and regenerated. Mahatma Gandhi said there is enough in the world for everyone's need, but not enough for anyone's greed. Our modern dinosaur society has become a greedy society, and we don't know when enough is enough. Satish Kumar. The book Small is Beautiful is also the story of how one man managed to stand in the way of a juggernaut, the stultifying series of errors in economics that stemmed, according to the author, from scientific materialism. I accept, of course, that the juggernaut continues, but would we have made as much progress as we have against it without this short book of essays and lectures, pulled together by Dr. Fritz Schumacher and published exactly 50 years ago this year? The first chapter about production goes to the heart of the problem as Schumacher saw it, as first and foremost a spiritual mistake. Modern man does not experience himself as a part of nature, but as an outside force destined to dominate and conquer it. He even talks of a battle with nature, forgetting that if he won the battle, he would find himself on the losing side. That's sort of the Anthropocene at work. And then, of course, we've moved past that to the Capitalocene. I'll read a little bit of the background and then shift forward because it really gets kind of in the weeds. When Small is Beautiful was published in May of 1973, Schumacher had long since completed the shift he had made from conventional Keynesianism to a radical skepticism, almost a maverick anti-economics position. He could so easily have been dismissed as a crank. But then, as he said, a crank is a small element in a machine that makes revolutions. This was a man about whom had once said his mantle would fall because Schumacher could really make the words sing. He had become radicalized after a visit to Burma, speaking of Myanmar, in 1955, when he saw suddenly how few of his conventional economic measures were relevant to an economy where the main product was Buddhist monks and their prayers. His journey continued via his foundation of the Intermediate Technology Development Group, now called Practical Action, in 1966. The philosopher Theodore Gross wrote in the foreword of the American edition of Small is Beautiful about his first encounter with the author. The first example of Schumacher's work I came across was an informal talk he gave in the mid-60s on the practicality of Gandhi's economic program in India. I was at the time editing a small pacifist weekly in London and was on the lookout for anything about Gandhi I could find. But here was a viewpoint I had never heard expounded even by ardent Gandhians, most of whom brushed over Gandhi's concern for village life and the spinning wheel as if it were the once regrettable folly of an otherwise great and important man. Pre-water frame spinning wheels or whatever. Not so of Schumacher. Step by step, he spelled out the essential good sense of a third world economic policy that rejected imitation of Western models. That is, breakneck urbanization, heavy capital investments, mass production, centralized development planning, and advanced technology. In contrast, Gandhi's scheme was to begin with the villages, to stabilize and enrich their traditional way of life by use of labor-intensive manufacture and handicrafts, and to keep the nation's economic decision-making as decentralized as possible, even if this slowed the pace of urban and industrial growth to a crawl. Schumacher had by then attracted a number of supporters and followers, initially people who had worked with him uh, during his 2 decades advising the National Coal Board, like George McRobbie, Duncan Smith, and John Davis, who would go on to launch the New Economics Foundation in London in 1986. Another key colleague was Satish Kumar, a Jane monk, who was then editing the magazine Resurgence in Devon, which gave him a platform in the UK. Another of the international mavericks and radicals was Bob Swan, who had been reading Schumacher's essays in Manas, published by fellow World War II conscientious objector Henry Geiger, and then in Resurgence. It was Bob Swan who organized Schumacher's 1974 tour to America, during which Schumacher asked him to form a parallel organization to Intermediate Technology Development Group, but Bob was not ready to do so. And anyway, this goes on to talk about the foundation of the EF Schumacher Society, et cetera, et cetera. And at some moment, by 1977, his views had become so popular and so mainstream that he was invited by President Carter of the solar panels on the White House. Note, of course, that there have been no solar panels put on the White House since then, and you might even ask that question for a variety of reasons. For a half-hour talk in the White House, Carter was keen to be photographed holding a copy of Small is Beautiful. By the end of that year, he was dead from exhaustion. What happened next? Schumacher died in Switzerland on the 4th of September, 1977. Small is Beautiful is now a classic, et cetera, one of the most influential books of all time, et cetera, et cetera. The next day, the Times, London Times, described Schumacher as a pioneer of post-capitalist, post-communist thought, and more than made up for its earlier alleged indifference by devoting its editorial to his work. The trouble was that, without Schumacher to be the face and voice of a new economics, all these powerful people have been unable to stop the economics juggernaut. You know, some people would like to say Piketty is that person. But anyway, there were by then a number of people who were determined not to let his message die. And so there is now a whole circle of institutions that he either founded or inspired so much that they borrowed his name to make the case again. And this goes on with other things. So what Boyle is doing here, chapter by chapter, we'll be looking afresh at Small is Beautiful, explaining some of the aspects that now seem a little obscure, putting it in the context of what has been happening since 1973, and looking ahead about what could happen next. We also suggest a number of elements and questions that could make for fascinating or useful discussions at colleges, homes, or churches, etc. So we begin. Let me read part of as far as I can get, probably section 1, maybe part of section 2. I'll probably get there, and then I can stop yammering. What is capital? Chapter 1, the problem of production. Few people will be easily convinced that the challenge to man's future cannot be met by making marginal adjustments here or there, or possibly by changing the political system. That's Schumacher in chapter 1. There is a fundamental difference between production in the economy and production in nature, because they're essentially self-producing and use only dispersed, that is, high entropy substances for their growth and maintenance. Green plants are called primary producers. By contrast, humans are strictly secondary producers. We use enormous inputs of high-grade energy and material resources extracted from the rest of the ecosphere to produce and maintain our bodies and all the products of our factories. In short, all production by the human enterprise involves the consumption of a much higher quantity of energy and material first produced by nature. From this material perspective, and note that before I had some literature on energy analysis of, this larger ecological view of production. From this material perspective, economic activity is more an inefficient conversion process than it is a productive process. And this is from William Rees. The first chapter came from a talk Schumacher gave in Zurich in 1972. He launches straight in without any kind of introduction, so perhaps we should do the same. What the chapter says, this chapter is about the idea of capital. Yes. Traditionally, this meant just land, labor, and manufactured capital, the three bases for creating wealth according to traditional economics. That's the Trinity, right? Land, labor, manufactured capital. We have become used since 1973 to authors and business writers trying out new forms of capital, whether that is social capital, like Robert Putnam. Robert Putnam writes the books on bowling alone. Intellectual capital, like Anne Brooking or Thomas Stewart. Natural capital by Paul Hawken, or even spiritual capital, perhaps Dana Zohar. Now, this is what Paul Hawkins said 25 years ago. The term natural capital, introduced to a broad audience by Schumacher in Small is Beautiful, was not immediately taken up by economists or academics. The term seemed to lay dormant until the past decade. Today it's being used commonly. Certainly in environmental circles and writings, Schumacher defined natural capital both narrowly and amorphously. Fossil fuels and the tolerance margins of nature and human subsistence. Today, we understand natural capital as the sum total of renewable and non-renewable resources, including the ecological systems and services that support life. It is different from conventionally defined capital in that natural capital cannot be produced by human activity. What was unimaginable 25 years ago was the speed with which the loss of natural capital would affect humankind. And that's kind of the Capitalocene argument that, a natural capital has been destroyed in that particular context. So yes, Schumacher looked at natural capital, and first of all, he looks at fossil fuel consumption. Bear in mind that the greenhouse effect had even yet to be identified when he was writing. What he wants to discuss is why the effort to use this capital as if it were ordinary income. He includes some figures looking ahead, explaining that by the 1970s, human beings were using about 7,000 million, 7 billion tons of coal equivalent. By the year 2000, about halfway back to 1973, our energy consumption would triple, he said, and it had already tripled since the end of World War II. Now, what about the year 2028, wherein some of us might even still be alive? When little children running about today will be planning for their retirement, he asks, will it have trebled again? And so there's a nice little graph here that asks that interesting kind of question. In the event, it hasn't been as bad as that because so many of us have partly managed to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. The greenhouse effect was actually identified back in 1824, but wasn't a popularized concept until the late 1980s and early 1990s. In fact, fossil fuel consumption has increased significantly over the past half century, around eightfold since 1950 and roughly doubling since 1980. There's good charts on this. And at some moment, I'll bless you with some of them. Even so, Schumacher's point still stands that first, you can't just carry on exponentially increasing fossil fuel consumption, which you can understand only when you grasp that humanity has been using up its natural capital as if it were a renewable resource. All these questions and answers are seen to be absurd the moment we realize that we're dealing with capital and not with income. Fossil fuels are not made by men. They cannot be recycled. Once they are gone forever. And second, don't forget the pollution this all causes, and this has come so suddenly that we hardly notice the fact that we are rapidly using up a certain kind of irreplaceable capital asset, namely the tolerance margins, which benign nature always provides. The whole notion of a kind of ecology, right? Meanwhile, we're blithely shooting towards a nuclear energy future as an alternative when we haven't even solved the problem of what to do with all that high-level radioactive waste that needs to be stored until it's safe in about 25,000 years' time. I'm sure that I shall be confronted with another, even more daring proposition, namely that future scientists and technologists will be able to devise safety rules and precautions of such perfection that the using, transporting, processing, and storing of radioactive materials in ever-increasing quantities will be made entirely safe. Also, that it will be the task of politicians and social scientists to create a world society in which wars or civil disturbances can never happen. Are we not far, far better off than we were a generation ago? Schumacher asks rhetorically, to which he answers, of course we are. Most, but by no means all of us. The substance of men is his third form of natural capital, after fossil fuels and energy and nature's tolerance margins. But he barely defines it. He just says what it isn't. It cannot be measured by gross national product. He says, perhaps it cannot be measured at all, except for certain symptoms of loss. However, this is not the place to go into the statistics of these symptoms, such as crime, drug addiction, vandalism, mental breakdown, rebellion, and so forth. Statistics never prove anything, which is quite right, or so Boyle believes. Then the chapter ends with a call to arms. What is my case? Simply that our most important task is to get off our present collision course. And who is there to tackle such a task? I think every one of us, whether young or old, powerful or powerless, rich or poor, influential or uninfluential, to talk about the future is useful only if it leads to action now. And what can we do now while we're still in the position of never having it so good? To say the least, which is already very much, we must thoroughly understand the problem and begin to see the possibility of evolving a new lifestyle with new methods of production and new patterns of consumption, a lifestyle designed for permanence. Now, what happened next? So, how is wealth created if we throw out the traditional trio of capitals, land, labor, and manufactured capital? One of the problems is that in the traditional model, you're allowed to substitute one capital for another, which means that it's okay to trash the planet as long as one of the other types of capital takes its place. And that doesn't work, said the late David Pearce, the doyen of the environmental economists and the author of Blueprint for a Small Planet. There are many types of environmental assets for which there are no substitutes. Paul Ekins, the first director of the New Economics Foundation, wrote a book called Wealth Beyond Measure, an Atlas of New Economics, published by Gaia Books in London in 1992 to coincide with the Earth Summit that year in Rio de Janeiro. He proposed a different system that had 4 capitals rather than the traditional 3. Ecological or natural capital, human capital, that is people and, ideas, knowledge, social and organizational capital, and manufactured capital, tools, machines, and infrastructure. 30 years on, we might make that 5 by dividing the social from the organizational capital because we know so much more about communities of social capital and institution and laws of organizational capital. Since then, all these different capitals have gone their own sweet ways, with the socioeconomists primarily interested in social capital, the institutional economists in organizational capital, the environmental economists in natural capital, and the patent lawyers in intellectual capital. In this way, the insights that began with Schumacher have become scattered to the winds. So, from this first section, there are questions for discussion. Number 1, Alvin Toffler, contemporary of Schumacher's, who wrote Future Shock and a bunch of other books, shocking books, used to ask business managers what it would cost them in real cash terms if none of their executives had ever been toilet trained. Well, we certainly know something about that with the current administration. What aspects of life do you think are vital for creating wealth? Number 2, could Schumacher's problem of production ever be solved? Number 3, can you define Schumacher's phrase, substance of man, which industrial production eats into? Number 4, few people will be easily convinced that the challenge to man's future cannot be met by making marginal adjustments here or there, or possibly by changing the political system, says Schumacher at the end of chapter 1. Are you one of them? What adjustments need to be made? So that's kind of the first set of study guide notes for Small is Beautiful, looked at 50 years later. And maybe I can read part of chapter 2 and then stop. Or the chapter 2 study. These are David Boyle's study guide notes for Small is Beautiful, chapter 2. Peace and permanence. The foundations of peace cannot be laid by individual prosperity in the modern sense, because such prosperity, if attainable by all, is attainable only by cultivating such drives of human nature as greed and envy, which destroy intelligence, happiness, serenity, and thereby the peacefulness of man. It could well be that rich people treasure peace more highly than poor people, but only if they feel utterly secure. And this is a contradiction in terms, especially these days. Their wealth depends on making inordinately large demands on limited world resources, and thus puts them in an unavoidable collision course, not primarily with the poor, who are weak and defenseless but with other rich people. Now, I think you can see that in current politics. That's Schumacher from chapter 2. Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product, GNP, now is over $800 billion a year, certainly more now. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution, and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear out highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. Clear cutting is coming. It counts napalm and counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Now, that's quoting Bobby Kennedy shortly before he was assassinated. Sad to see how his son has done with some of those same ideas. Chapter 2 is primarily about how economists measure success and how their measurements are leading the world into great peril. It is also the most pronounced spiritual chapter, and none the worse for it, placing wisdom and God at the heart of the new economics, as if people mattered. What the chapter says these days, Schumacher says at the start of the second chapter, everyone believes that increasing prosperity is the path to peace. On the contrary, he says, one may look in vain for historical evidence that the rich regularly have been more peaceful than the poor, but then it can be argued that they have never felt secure against the poor, that their aggressiveness stemmed from fear, and that the situation would be quite different if everyone were rich. Now, why should a rich man go to war? He has nothing to gain, and not the poor, the exploited, the oppressed, most likely to do so, as they have nothing to lose but their chains. Oh, who said that? The road to peace, it is argued, is to follow the road to riches. Now, the problem is that there are so many comfortable reasons for believing it. It isn't exactly that we don't want peace, but just that it isn't hard to accept a little more prosperity too. The issue, says Schumacher, is that it requires nothing more from us, nothing purifying or accepting. In fact, it requires no moral effort at all. Gandhi used to talk disparagingly of dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. But is it not precisely this dream which we can now implement in reality with our marvelous powers of science and technology? Why ask for virtues which man may never acquire when scientific rationality and technical competence are all that is needed? Technocracy, recall, right? He then talks about his former colleague, the man who rescued him from detention as an enemy alien in 1942, the great economist John Maynard Keynes, in the famous essay he had written a decade earlier in the 1930s called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Keynes warned that the time when we can relax into our economic future isn't yet, and that for at least another century, right? 1942 or whatever to 2042, or as Schumacher puts it, the road to heaven is paved with bad intentions. Next, he talks about fuel requirements in 1966 and his own calculations about what the situation might look like in 2000. This chapter was taken from an article he had written for Resurgence magazine in 1970. The chapter borrows from some of the conclusions of the previous chapter. Exploratory calculations, of course, that do not prove anything. A proof about the future is in any case impossible, and is sagely remarked that all predictions are unreliable, particularly those about the future. What is required is judgment and exploratory calculations that can at least help to inform our judgment. In any case, our calculations in a most important respect understate the magnitude of the problem. It's not realistic to treat the world as a unit. Fuel resources are very unevenly distributed, and any shortage of supplies, no matter how slight, would immediately divide the world into haves and have-nots along entirely novel lines. The specially favored areas, such as the Middle East and North Africa, would attract envious attention on a scale scarcely imaginable today, while some high consumption areas, such as Western Europe and Japan, would move into the unenviable position of residual legatees. Here is the source of conflict, if there ever was one. No country can just keep on growing and growing. Schumacher concludes, we find, therefore, that the idea of unlimited economic growth more and more until everybody is saturated with wealth needs to be seriously questioned on at least two counts. That is, the availability of basic resources and alternatively or additionally, the capacity of the environment to cope with the degree of interference implied. Schumacher uses the term GNP, whereas mainly these days most authorities use GDP, as they have done since 1991. Now, the main difference between the two is that GNP, gross national product, measures everything, sometimes more than once, and GDP, gross domestic product, measures the value of the total output of the national economy, but not, for example, the value of citizens living abroad and their businesses. If human vices, such as greed and envy, are systematically cultivated, the inevitable result is nothing less than a collapse of intelligence. A man driven by greed or envy loses the power of seeing things as they really are, of seeing things in their roundness and wholeness, and his very successes become failures. If whole societies become infected by these vices, they may indeed achieve astonishing things, but they may also become increasingly incapable of solving the most elementary problems of everyday existence. The gross national product may rise rapidly as measured by statisticians, but not as experienced by actual people who find themselves oppressed by increasing frustration, alienation, insecurity, and so forth. After a while, even the gross national product refuses to rise any further, not because of scientific or technological failure, but because of a creeping paralysis of non cooperation, as expressed in various types of escapism on the part not only of the oppressed and exploited, but even of highly privileged groups. Then he concentrates on the non material elements of his argument, because Keynes said that universal prosperity isn't attainable unless we keep our idealism muted. Because foul is useful, then how can prosperity lead to peace, he asks. The exclusion of wisdom from economic science and technology was something which we could perhaps get away with for a little while, as long as we were relatively unsuccessful. But now that we've become very successful, the problem of spiritual and moral truth moves into the central position. This is kind of the Tom Weber kind of thing. That means, says Schumacher, that we have to study the economics of permanence. We need to reorientate around wisdom. There can be growth towards limited objectives, but there can't be unlimited generalized growth. So what do we need from scientists and technologists, asks Schumacher. His answer is that we need methods and equipment which are cheap enough so that they are accessible to virtually everyone, suitable for small-scale application, and compatible with man's need for creativity. This doesn't sound so bad. The final one on this list may be the most interesting because it is so reminiscent of the Victorian art critic John Ruskin, who actually has a theory of political economy, who in his book Onto This Last famously named the opposite of wealth as illeth, not Lilith, but illeth, and warned that there were circumstances, even in 1860, when it could overwhelm wealth. Needless to say, this illeth is not a term modern economists use. Maybe they should. And so hunting down the definition of illeth coined by John Ruskin in the 1860s is the reverse of wealth. It's sort of, anti-capital in that particular sense, in the sense of ill being the opposite of well. In Ruskin's view, wealth, therefore, is the possession of the valuable by the valiant. And in considering it as a power existing in a nation, the two elements, that is, the value of the thing and the valor of its possessor, must be estimated together. There's a rethinking of property in that sense. Whence it appears that many of the persons commonly considered wealthy are in reality no more wealthy than the locks of their own strong boxes are. They being inherently and eternally incapable of wealth, and operating for the nation in an economical point of view either as pools of dead water and eddies in a stream, which, so long as the stream flows, are useless or serve only to drown people, but may become of importance in a state of stagnation should the stream dry. Or else, as dams in a river, of which the ultimate service depends not on the dam, but the miller or the beaver, or else as mere accidental stays and impediments, acting not as wealth, but, for we ought to have a correspondent term, as illeth, causing various devastation and trouble around them in all directions, good trouble, or lastly, act not at all, or are merely animated conditions of delay, no use being possible of anything they have until they are dead, in which last condition they are nevertheless often useful as delays and impedimenta if a nation is apt to move too fast. So that's an interesting point of view by Ruskin, of course. Um, and I would propose, or at least from a research point of view, that Illith does describe in some ways catastrophe or catastrophic elements, which I have already yammered a bit about from a much more mathematical point of view. And there's a whole bunch here that goes on Ruskin and Catholic schools and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to stop uh, and end on some things about, well, there's a bunch more. I probably wouldn't I'll waste another 20 minutes of your time. And let me suggest to you that I hope that you will read a little bit of this and be sufficiently interested to look at how small is better. And if you haven't read it, you should read it. And of course, as Tom Weber has given us already a good introduction to it, I think that there's much spiritually or morally or ethically, but I also think that there are economic elements. And the economic element, in a political economy sense, are for thinking about what counts as a steady state economy. A steady state economy is not static. It is probably even more dynamic than a dynamic economy simply because it is constantly self-correcting or being self-conscious. And I think that's probably what a steady state economy should look like. Now, whether people fully subscribe to that is problematic in a world that has massive trade and et cetera, et cetera. But I will include that and get ready to stop. So let's see if there are any questions. GNP, nah, I live by GTA. Yes, there should be a Florida version of a Grand Theft Auto. Um, yes, Great Litter of Turds is staying. Everyone to buy one. And of course, there's a photo op today with a different version, one of each of the Tesla on the, I guess, the south side of the White House with Trump kicking tires on a red Tesla S, I guess. And let's see, social capital, swastikars. Yes, all righty. Anyway, let me thank you for your attention. I will plan now to stop the proverbial live stream, and so we can get back and prepare for